What are the first memories you have of rumblings from the Gulf, and a sense that you might be involved in something that's going on overseas? What are the very first memories you have about what eventually becomes the Gulf War?
Yeah, very specific memories, because I remember August of 1990 that Saddam Hussein sent his military crashing across the border with Kuwait. And so I remember that happening, but to me it was, when was the Guard ever activated? The last time we'd been activated in much, very many of us had been back in Korea. Very few Guardsmen had ever been activated for Vietnam. So it was kind of a distant thing. Grenada had happened, Beirut had happened. We were never involved. So I remember when that happened, never really thought that much about it until the September drill, that we arrived at our armories, and my battalion commander, Colonel Gary Meeks, contacted all of us battery commanders and said, hey, look, Fort Sill is kind of looking at us, or actually the Pentagon leadership would be looking at us to go to Fort Sill, which would be our mobilization station. We might be getting activated for what's going on over there in Iraq, in Kuwait. Well, that really shocked all of us. We thought, my gosh, is that really? Nothing happened. He told us to stay close to our phones over the next week, right after that September drill, and we were all, and this was the days before everybody had their cell phone. So he wanted to know, hey, if we get the call, I need to be able to contact you, stay close to where we can. Nothing ever happened. And so I called my unit about a week later and said, what's going on? And they said, we're on the back burner. They don't need us. It doesn't look like it's going to be a thing. So the remainder of that fall of 1990, we pretty much just back to business as usual, working my civilian job. And then in November, the week prior to Thanksgiving, November 1990, we got the call. And it raised every hair in the back of my neck.
Wow.
I thought, wow, we are being activated. And, from then on, it was just, we got activated, and then we mobilized at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then we deployed to Saudi in January.
And, I mean, by this time, you'd been in the Guard for about 10 or 11 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And had you kind of concluded by this point that National Guard service would involve floods or things like that?
Yes.
I mean, did it ever occur to you that you might deploy overseas, let alone to the Gulf?
Well, I thought that there was always a slim possibility. I knew the history of the unit. The unit had been activated. My unit, which was the 936th and 937th Field Artillery Battalions, way back when, in the 50s, they went to Korea. So I thought, there's that history, and I guess there's a slim possibility. But after 10 years of being in the Guard, I thought, I saw everything that happened in the 80s. Like I said, Grenada and Beirut and some other little actions that took place here and there. I thought the chances are pretty slim. And then all of a sudden, for this to have happened, of course, the defense budget cuts required the military to rely more on the reserve component, which would be the Army Reserve or the Army National Guard.
Because the Cold War had recently ended, right? Or it was certainly in the process of unraveling, so we can reduce the size of our military.
Exactly.
Right, and so that's one reason then that the Guard is going to be heavily activated.
Yes.
For that reason. What was your civilian job at the time?
I would work for USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, as an agronomist. I was working in Boonville, Arkansas at that time.
Did they say at the outset you're going for 6 months, going for 2 months, or you're going for the duration? What did they?
6 month activation was we knew that going in, that we were going to be activated for 6 months, and then depending after that, we didn't know how much longer it would be, but we knew 180 days.
Okay. And so when did you activate? When did
we activated? It would have been almost a week prior to Thanksgiving of 1990.
Okay. So November of 90.
I think it was the 21st of November, if I'm not mistaken.
And you were with the Rogers, Arkansas Battery?
Yeah, Charlie Battery, 1st Battalion in Rogers, yes.
Okay. And so what was the first step of preparing? So I'm kind of interested in just hearing the steps on the way to, you make your way from Northwest Arkansas to the Middle East. So what was that first step of
first step
preparing and getting ready?
as a guardsman, as a guard unit, you activate at home station. So all of the unit members came to the Rogers Armory. We met there at home station, and we went through all of our files, made sure that all of our dependent information, all of that stuff was up to date. Soldier readiness packets had to get updated and prepared prior to us going to the next step in that whole process, which was mobilization, which was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So after we went through home station activation, then we went to Mob Station Fort Sill, and that's where all of our equipment went, and we got our shots, everything that had to happen happened there to ready us to deploy to the Middle East. And after we got there in is right after Thanksgiving of '90, we got to Fort Sill. And then we were there for a month. And so we were out on the weapons ranges, making sure that we were able to qualify, making sure that we were able to don our protective equipment, which going over, Saddam Hussein had shown a propensity to use chemicals when his war with Iran.
Right.
So we didn't know what we were going to face over there. So we needed to be able to properly put on the what they call the mission-oriented protective posture gear, MOP gear, the protective mask and the charcoal suit.
Yeah.
We had to go through all that, qualify with our weapons, both individual and crew-served weapons, and of course on the howitzers. We needed to be able to prove that we were able to do our artillery job, which we'd already done that at Fort Chaffee, and we'd done that at Camp Grayling, Michigan, and Fort Carson, Colorado over the years. But we needed to show it to the folks at Fort Sill.
And so as all this is going on, of course, pressure's being put on Saddam Hussein just to get out of Kuwait, and there won't be an invasion. We know now, looking back on the Gulf War, that obviously to World War II, relative to Korea, relative to Vietnam, it's not going to be a high casualty conflict, right? And we know that now, looking back, not high casualty on the U.S. side or on the Allies side.
Right.
We didn't know that going in, and I have a very distinct memory of hearing people talk about, the thousands of body bags that would come back because Saddam Hussein is one of the best militaries in the world, and there is this concern about, him using poison gas and all of that. As an officer, I mean, how much was that on your mind? Because again, looking back, we know how things unfolded, but you don't know this before you get there. He may use poison gas.
Right.
What they're saying about the quality of his military may turn out to be right, and they may turn out to be a serious adversary. So how are you working with that in your mind, in addition to getting the guys trained, getting all their paperwork signed, and all of that stuff?
Well, it was significant because being an artillery unit, when we trained, as far as if we had an OPFOR, an opposing force, if we were aggressed, by bad guys with, trying to take out an artillery unit, we would train on that at when we went to Chaffee or Camp Grayling, Michigan, or Fort Carson, Colorado. We trained on that, but it was we never really thought that as an artillery unit we would face that maybe so much, although we were what they considered a high-value target. They wanted to take artillery out.
Sure.
But so when we got to Fort Sill, we started to ramp up and realize, hey, we might be getting hit by, somebody wants to take out an artillery battery. We need to get serious about how do we respond to a ground attack. We're an artillery unit. We're not infantrymen. We're not the grunts. We have weaponry. Of course, the 8-inch howitzer, but you can't turn that on a guy that's coming at you with an AK-47.
Yeah.
We had 50 caliber machine guns. We had an M60 machine guns. So we trained up pretty heavily on those things to make sure that we would know how to engage a bad guy that's coming at us. And then like you've mentioned, which I think is, you said something there about the thousands of body bags. That was a news story in the fall of '90 about I think George W. Bush, or the Pentagon determined that we needed to send a lot of body bags over. I think the number was somewhere around 10,000. That news story leaked out. So the thinking was, yes, Saddam has used chemical weaponry against Iran, and so why would he not use it against us? And so when we're getting ready to go over, we heard about the 10,000 body bags, or however many it was. So we trained significantly on being able to wear that protective gear properly, because we thought very good chance that we were going to be exposed.
Yeah. How did your junior soldiers take it? Again, we're going into the situation. We don't really know what's coming. We're hearing about the body bags. We're hearing about the poison gas. How did your young soldiers respond? And not just the young soldiers, but the old guys too. It was a shocker to us all, that we were looking at the potential of really serious armed conflict. Yeah.
So from top to bottom, all of us kind of had, when we were going through activation to home station that first weekend in November.
Yeah.
That was actually toward the end of November, but there's kind of like a shell shock in all of our faces. This is really happening, guys. And so, yeah, it was a significant thing. All of a sudden, you're living your civilian life, you're working your job, you're at home with your family, you're doing your thing in your community, and all of a sudden you're uprooted. And now we're facing this.
Yeah.
It was a shell shock for every one of us. And so, even as an officer, being able to project some kind of a calm, I guess, it was hard to do. I had a wife and a 1-year-old child at the time. All of a sudden you're ripped out of that.
Did you have any interactions heading into the situation? Any interactions with Vietnam vets who were still in uniform, and did their experiences all of a sudden become really interesting to you?
Well, what's interesting about that, in 1990, there were a lot of Vietnam vets in the Guard, a bunch of them. For instance, the first sergeant of the Springdale unit had been a Vietnam vet.
Wow.
And so we had a lot of those guys that had been there, and it was great to have that experience as well, that steadying influence, as it were. We had several people in all of our units, all the 142nd, that had Vietnam time. Guys that put in 3 years, initial hitch, went to Vietnam, they were drafted, and then they wanted to fill out their, get their 20 years in the Guard, and here they were.
Yeah.
They might have gotten out for a while, and then they came back to the Guard, and so having those fellas, to be able to talk to them and say, hey, what are we looking at here? It was a good influence to have those Vietnam vets in our units.
Not bad. Just to stick on that theme for a little bit, because Vietnam kind of comes up with whatever conflict we have. There's always that comparison, and so there's, if I remember right, there was that discussion. We're getting into another Vietnam, and then after the war. After the conflict, the President George H.W. Bush says that the Vietnam syndrome is over, and all of that. Did you feel at the time, as you're preparing, did you feel that the country was very much behind you? Did you feel the support of the country?
Yes, I think that the country made an effort, thinking back to Vietnam. The country really made an effort to not treat us that same way. Of course, we were over there, but there was a lot of support that we felt from home. And they made the effort to get us videotapes of wives and families to us. Yeah. There was a real effort to make sure that we felt like we were not going to be treated as the Vietnam vets. And fast forward to when we came home. That really made an impression on me, because when we came back, we flew into the Bangor Airport, Bangor, Maine. And we were one of the last, well, not one of the last units, but we came home in June of 91. So a lot of units had already come home and had already come to Bangor, Maine, and other places like that. And so we figured, well, we'd heard about the turnout at some of these airports. If folks just turned out for the returning vets, and I thought, well, okay, here we are. It's June. Pretty much the news is worn off of the vets returning. That wasn't the way it was. We flew into to Bangor, Maine, a National Guard unit. We got off the plane and we were welcomed. There were the VFW and the American Legion and the Housewives, and there were people that lined the corridors as we got off the plane, and we felt like heroes. And it really made an impression on me because I just felt like it was more of that sentiment that we don't want to treat these guys like the guys coming home from Vietnam were treated. We were welcomed, and it was really nice.
Yeah, the yellow ribbons. And
the yellow ribbons, yes.
And so, where did you actually arrive then in the Middle East? Did you fly into Saudi?
Yes, we flew into Saudi. I think it was King Khalid Airport, I believe was near the port of Dhahran, where we flew into Saudi on a 747. They call them Casper, the Friendly Ghost, because they painted them all white except for the tail markings, so there were no repercussions on, I think it was Delta at the time, or whoever it was. But we flew into King Khalid near the port of Dhahran. Our equipment was still being transshipped across the ocean didn't come into the port of Dhahran for several weeks.
Wow. So
yeah, we were just sitting over there. They put us in his unique experience because there were high-rise buildings there around the port of Dhahran, and we got put in those high-rise buildings. There were apartments, and we were bored out of our minds, just waiting for our equipment to come back. We had nothing to do except for watch the Scud missiles, which were not much of a threat at all. We were in King Khalid Airport. There was a Patriot missile battery there at King Khalid, and for obvious reasons, because there were military jets and bigger airliners coming in there. So there was a Patriot missile battery there. And whenever they would launch a Scud, we would get the warning that a Scud launch had happened somewhere in Iraq, coming our way. Those things were notoriously inaccurate. But when they came within close to Dhahran, Port of Dhahran or King Khalid Airport, we got to see those Patriots. They were probably 3 or 4 miles away, but you could see forever there in Saudi. We'd see those Patriots go up. And of course, you couldn't see the Scud, but you could see the impact. It was like, you talk about a bunch of guys cheering, because we're really bored anyway.
Yeah.
But just to see one of those Patriots shoot a Scud out of the sky was amazing. We saw that happen just numerous times.
Wow. What was your very first impression of Saudi Arabia, or the first thing that occurred to you? I'm always interested, and you've got American forces going to a war zone. They're kind of in that American bubble on the plane, and then the door opens. And, what is the very first impression you had of being in the Middle East in Saudi Arabia?
Sand everywhere.
This doesn't look like Arkansas.
No, it does look like Arkansas. And like I said, the terrain is such that you can see forever. Once you get away from the city, the built-up area, you can see forever. Sand dunes and sand dunes and sand dunes, but there is a lot of just flat terrain you can just see. I was also impressed because we were there in January, and
so you arrived in January?
Yeah. Okay. I think we flew out of Duncan Air Force Base at Gore, Oklahoma on the 18th of January. We flew out the day that Norman Schwarzkopf initiated the air war. I believe, was the 18th of January, and that it began that day. We flew out the night of the 18th. But once we landed there, like I said, this was in January. It would have been the 19th or so. It was a 24-hour plus trip to get over there. But when we landed, the sand. I was also really surprised at how cold it got there in January. When we finally got our equipment at the port of Dhahran, we went out into the desert and staged in preparation for what we were going to do with the 7th Corps. I was very surprised at how cold it got over there. I thought it was a warm climate all
Is
the
this
time.
at night, so hot in the day and then cold at night? Or
Yeah,
got
it was.
cold?
Yes,
Okay.
it wasn't so hot during the day. I did get to be later, but
Okay.
it surprised me. It would probably get up to 50, no, I don't know, 60, 65 during the day, but the nights were pretty cold. So
Yeah.
it surprised me.
So the air war begins in January 91, and so you arrive just after that. And I think, or you leave
That very day, yeah.
the day the air war begins. If I remember right, that was kind of a famous moment in news history. There's Bernard Shaw, I think,
Yes.
from CNN, was
CNN.
in the hotel and
Yeah.
reporting on the airstrikes. When did the actual ground invasion
27th or 28th is when the ceasefire happened
of February?
of February of 91. It was a 100-hour ground war, 4 days. I mean, it wasn't much, you know.
Yeah.
For 4 days, we were just going like crazy trying to keep up. When the ground war happened, we shot in support of maneuver through the ground war. We actually shot about 2 days prior to that in something that was called an artillery raid, which is a non-standard artillery mission. We just shot some rounds into Iraq trying to get their indirect fire weapon systems to respond to us, so then the MLRS would counter battery on them.
Okay.
So that was, but we never, I don't think I saw a shot fired in anger the whole time I was there.
Other than your own battery?
No, yeah. Other than the Scuds, which I could actually say they were, targeting us,
Right.
I never had my unit, Charlie Battery, the
Yeah.
1st Battalion. We never had anybody engage us. All those guys were just, they got pounded in the sand.
It was over so quickly.
We overwhelmed them.
When did it become clear to you that all of the anxiety that was part of the buildup of the war, the body bags, the getting ready for the poison gas attack and all of that, when did it become clear to you that that's probably not how this is going to work out? Was it watching the Scuds get blown out of the sky and realizing, is that when you realized these guys are way overmatched? And
Well, in reference to the chemical attacks, when we kicked this thing off, when we did those 2 artillery raids with the 7th Corps Artillery, we were all suited up in the MOP gear, the mission-oriented protective posture, everything except for the protective mask. That way, the last thing you have to put on would be the mask. We had on those dead-blame charcoal suits that turned our uniforms black, because they were impregnated with charcoal. We had those things on from the get-go, and we were just hot. I mean, it was cooler over there than what we expected, but you have your regular uniform on plus that MOP suit.
right.
We were just sweating like crazy. Well, a day or 2 into the ground war, of course, it was only 4 days, 100 hours.
Yeah.
Word came down and says, hey, you can take the MOP suits off, keep them handy, but you don't have to be wearing those things all the time. We thought, thank goodness, because those things were miserable to be in.
Yeah.
But it would be awful if we'd had to wear those things through the whole thing, or if it had been a real thing, if the war had lasted longer, if we'd been in those things in a hot desert environment, I just think, man, that would have just been terrible.
Would have been miserable. But after 2 days, you're able to take those
Yeah,
off.
after 2 days, they said, hey, you guys don't have to worry about it so much, and we thought, hey, things have changed, because we thought we were going to be wearing these things for the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so we were glad about that. And again, we could not keep up. Now, to try to understand
With the forces moving.
yeah,
toward
we
Iraq.
couldn't keep up with maneuver.
Yeah.
So what we had was a M110 Alpha 2 8-inch self-propelled howitzer. It was a beast. It was the biggest thing in the Army artillery inventory. And it is the most accurate weapon system that the Army had. But it was slow. It was terribly slow.
Yeah.
The chassis, the drivetrain, everything, it was basically 60s technology. Well, what were we trying to keep up with in maneuver? M1 Abrams tanks, which could book across the desert,
Yeah.
and M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Those things could scoot. So we were all the time trying to keep up with them. Well, they didn't meet a lot of resistance. Of course, that's the whole study of Desert Storm was the left hook out of the desert, out of the western Iraqi desert. The Iraqis, they oriented their best units as if we would come straight out of Saudi and go right up at them. Well, that was ridiculous. That's not how the American military does it. Schwarzkopf engineered the left hook out of the desert. We went way out into the western Iraqi desert, and then we came in and we flanked them. It is an envelopment. And we hit them behind those better formations. And the Battle of 73 Easting, which was the big tank battle, another example of how most of the time we name a battle after a river or a hill or something like that. Well, there's featureless Iraqi western desert terrain. So they call it the Battle of 73 Easting because it was a line of longitude.
Wow.
That's where we're at. So this is and that was where the armored units that hit the Iraqi Republican Guard divisions, I think it's the Hammurabi and the Medina and Tawakalana. I can't remember who was there, but they were Republican Guard armored divisions, T-55, T-72s. They got hit with M1 Abrams tanks.
Yeah.
And they got sliced up pretty badly. It was amazing. When you read those accounts, if you go back and read the accounts of 73 Easting, those M1 Abrams tanks were acquiring those Iraqi targets at a mile.
Wow.
They acquired them at a mile. And they were, at some point then, after they'd acquired them, somewhat less than a mile, they engaged them. And I think they were having greater than 85 or 90% kills from the first shot.
Yeah.
The Iraqis didn't even know they were in a battle yet. They were also in a movement to contact with the U.S. forces. They knew we were going to hit. They were coming to take us on. The Republican Guard, they were pretty good. But then when the U.S. armored forces hit them, again, the Iraqis didn't even realize that they had encountered the enemy before they started getting hit and lit up.
So this is
amazing.
such an unequal fight, and the troops sort of on the cutting edge, they're moving so quickly
Yes.
that y'all are having a hard time keeping.
We couldn't keep up. Those old M110 Alpha 2s, yes, we did keep up. Yes, we did fire and support a maneuver as much as we could.
Yeah.
But there wasn't enough resistance to really stop the maneuver guys.
Yeah.
They were able to blow and go, and for us the old M110 Alpha 2 8-inch howitzers to keep up was difficult, especially in that sand.
A lot of vets who went to the Gulf talk about seeing the Iraqi soldiers just surrendering in droves.
Yes.
Did you witness that yourself?
We had.
What did you see?
In one position, one morning, we were. It was an awful night move. Again, we were just trying to keep up. We moved all night long, trying to keep up with wherever it was we were supposed to go. As a battery commander, I took my advanced party out, and what we did, we would go out and we would set up the gun positions, and then the main body, the howitzers, and the main body of the battery followed. So at daybreak, we were in this position. Well, the whole battalion was, and of course we were all spread out about 3,000 to 5,000 meters apart from each other. The batteries were, and as we were setting up my battery position, I looked off in the distance. It was probably, 2,000, 3,000 meters away. I saw these guys moving around, and again, you could see forever out there. And we were used to seeing Bedouin tribesmen. They're ubiquitous in that part of the world. They're all over the place with their sheep and their camels and their goats and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it was early morning, and I was seeing them at a distance, and I thought, well, we got some more Bedouins out there. As it got lighter, and as I looked, and one of the guys in my advanced party looked and said, hey, I don't think those are Bedouins. And so I took my binoculars out and I looked at them, and I realized that I would see these guys moving around, and then they'd drop out of sight. And then some other guys, they were obviously looking at us, but they obviously also had fighting positions, trenches dug in. So I called my battalion, and I told them, by this time the battalion was on the road. The battalion with the 3 firing batteries, with the howitzers, were on the road to where we were at. And I called my battalion, I said, I think we've got some Iraqis out here. And I said, I don't know what they're going to do, but I said, there's a number of them out here about 3,000 meters from my position. And so my battalion commander, the S3, he got back on. He said, hang on, we'll be there. Just don't do anything foolish. All I had on my advanced party is my vehicle. I had an M60 mounted on my vehicle, and I had a deuce and a half with a 50 caliber machine gun. So, we had something.
Yeah.
And everybody else had their M16s. Well, we were looking at those Iraqis, didn't know what they were going to do. The battalion the main body arrived, and my S3 came over, Major Bo Davenport, and he said, okay, he said, we're going to advance on those guys, pull out a couple of your ammo carriers, which also have a ring-mounted 50. He said, we're going to advance on them and see what they do. I thought, great. So we advanced on this position with two 5.48 ammo carriers with ring-mounted 50s. And as soon as we started moving towards them, if it was white, those guys were waving it in the air. They just wanted to surrender.
Wow.
We got to that position. We had over 120 Iraqis surrender to us. And those fellas had all kinds of weaponry. They had AK machine guns, AKMs. They had mortars. If they had wanted to take us on, they could have wiped us out so easily. Like I said, all we had was an M60 and an M2 50 cal in my battery position. The other two battery positions had about the same. But if those guys had wanted to take us on, they had the weaponry.
Wow.
But they had been pounded in the sand. They've been basically left to die. No logistical support. They've been left out there in the desert, bypassed.
Wow.
They were not Republican guards. They were conscripts. These guys were more or less pressed into service. And an example of that, one of the fellas and all they wanted was something to eat or drink. They were just in bad way. One of the fellas I was talking to, he came up to me. He had on a Chicago Bears sweatshirt.
Wow.
Chicago Bears. And so I kind of looked at him, and he had on camouflage pants. And anyway, we talked, and what the guy's story was that he was in school in the U.S.
Wow.
And he came back home for the holidays, between semesters. He came back home, and guess what? He got picked up and said, buddy, you're in the Iraqi army now.
Wow.
Well, that was the quality of what we faced out there in the Western Desert. That's why Schwarzkopf went around that way, so we wouldn't face those best formations. So yeah, we had, in that one position, like I said, we had over 120 Iraqis surrender to us, and we saw a lot of that.
So this guy spoke English, obviously.
Yeah, very well.
And so he told you, what had happened to him. Did you have any other kind of interactions with him, just that you remember?
There were officers. The officers of that unit were different completely. You could tell they were professional soldiers. They kind of held themselves apart from the rabble, it appeared to me, trying to act dignified, and I guess I probably would have as well.
Sure.
But all the enlisted men, they were just, get us out of here. The officers were like, treat us with dignity or something like that. But,
yeah. Did they show any fear, or did they assume that that the rules of war that the U.S. and its allies observed, that those laws would hold?
I think they understood that we were the good guys, as far as we did abide by the rules of war. Those guys were just, and we were very kind to them. We understood what was going on. They were starving. They didn't have enough water. One unique part of that there were so many of them that were devout in their faith as Muslims. We had to give them were MREs, for heaven's sakes. So some of our MREs, there was a nasty little thing in the old MREs. It's called a pork patty. It was dehydrated.
Oh yeah.
If they identified that as pork,
they
wouldn't eat it,
even if they're hungry.
No, of course there's other things in the MRE they could eat.
Yeah.
But I was impressed with that.
Wow.
They would not eat the pork patty. But
yeah.
we took care of them. We were kind to them. But back to your question, some of those guys that could speak English, they communicated with us. They said, we do not want to be caught out here after having surrendered. There are, according to them, they said there are some Republican Guard units that are picking up. If you surrender, if you're not still in your position, if you're out here acting as if you've deserted or went AWOL, they'll pick you up and I don't know,
Execute you.
could execute you.
Yeah.
which we could not pick them up. We didn't have the transport facility to take those fellas anywhere. We basically told them, get on the road and walk south. And they looked at us like,
Really?
Are you kidding me? You're going to leave us out here in the desert? I said, we can't haul you.
So you just told them to just
Keep
keep
on
going
walking.
that way.
The MPs were coming forward and policing up all of those
Yeah.
guys that were surrendering like that. But
Wow.
there was a real fear there.
Sure.
And I don't know how real it was. If the Republican, Saddam might have put that story out. Don't
Right.
you dare surrender
Right.
or go AWOL or anything like that. So who knows? But yeah, when they got to us, they felt like they'd arrived.
So a big build-up. You don't know what's coming. Sense of anxiety definitely is going to go with that. Not just for the troops, but for their family and friends back home. Pretty quickly, once things get going, you realize this is a really uneven match, and you've got these folks surrendering en masse, and Scuds are getting blown out of the sky, and you can't keep up with the frontline troops because things are moving so quickly. So this thing's going to wrap up really quickly. After all of the build-up and the getting ready, was there a sense of relief that, in the end, it's over quickly? Was there a sense of disappointment? Like, man, I wish we would have been able to use a little bit of what we trained to do. Or was it a combination of both? Or
It was a combination of both, and I'm able to actually think about this because I ran into some other another National Guard unit that was also an 8-inch unit. It was from the area of Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. It also got activated. It also deployed. It also went over there, but they did not shoot in support of maneuver. They did everything except do their wartime mission, what they've been trained to do. And I compare what the 142nd did. We did it all. And if you read some of the accounts of what the 142nd did, we were able to do everything we were trained to do. We shot in support of maneuver. We got on the ground. We were a part of the ground war. So when it was all over, I guess there was, I'm not so, machismo that I said, I wish it would have kept going on, and we could have, been the bad, really finished up Saddam. Although later I wish we had. But there was a lot of relief. We were happy that it was over. We wanted to get back home. We were 6 months away from home and wives and family, and there was. I think by and large we were happy it was over. We weren't there to be regular Army guys.
Yeah.
Although we were. As we were activated, we were part of the Army.
How did that relationship go? Was it a good relationship between the active duty and the Guard? Or?
I think by and large it was.
Yeah.
We proved ourselves that we were a good unit. We'd done that through the 80s. The Army knew that the 142nd Field Artillery Brigade was a good unit. We were well trained. We kept our equipment in good shape. We had most of our primary MOS slots. The guys had gone to school. They knew their primary MOS. We were of course, I'm biased, but we were a good unit. There were a lot of Guard units that weren't activated for Desert Storm. A lot of artillery Guard units that were activated for Desert Storm. I say a lot. There weren't really a lot, but there were some others, such as that other unit, that I'm sure was a good unit too. But we were able to go over there and do what we had to do. But once we done what they'd asked us to do, we were ready to go home.
Yeah. Maybe the most stark symbol of the way the Iraqi military was just overpowered, catastrophically from their point of view, was, images that come back of the so-called Highway of Death.
Yeah.
Where was that Highway of Death? Was that in Kuwait itself?
It was just north of Kuwait City, and after it was all over, we were positioned about, I can't remember how many miles north of Kuwait City that we were, but the ceasefire had happened.
Yeah.
So at one point we went down to Kuwait City, and I've got pictures of Kuwait City and what it looked like. So we went through that area where the Highway of Death happened, which As I understand it, is basically the Iraqis were trying to get out of
Yeah.
Kuwait City and get back to Iraq, and they got caught. And they were driving whatever they could. There were military vehicles, there were Chevy Suburbans, there were Hondas and Toyotas, because they just raided the Kuwait City car dealerships, jumped in these vehicles, and they hauled it north. So you would see this weird mix of military vehicles and Chevy Suburbans that were shot to pieces and that they got caught in. And I told you earlier, when we got there, all of that wreckage had been bulldozed off of that highway, and all of the awful, the bodies had been cleaned up and buried. So we didn't get to see that. But we did get to see the result of all those vehicles shot up, pushed off to the sides, and I cannot imagine what that would have been like to have been in that convoy. The Air Force just is a field day for them.
And you saw a similar scene somewhere else? Is that
Yes,
right?
my first sergeant and I, my first sergeant named Ronnie Henry, good fella, great guy, passed away. We were out, and we were on an ancillary road near Kuwait City that there was another convoy on that had also tried to get out. And he and I happened upon this convoy. We just saw it, and so we started looking around it. And obviously, we were trophy hunting, looking for something, an AK-47 or some trophy to take home. So we happened on this shut-up convoy. It wasn't very big. But as we got close to it, we realized it had not been cleaned up. And I told Ronnie, I said, and he agreed with me, I said, these guys are still in there. So let's get out of here. And we did. So yeah, there was more than just that initial highway of death that we happened upon. There were some other roads that smaller convoys got hit as well.
Yeah. And we know that when Iraq invaded Kuwait, that a lot of atrocities inflicted on the Kuwaiti people. Did you have any interactions with the Kuwaiti people? What memories do you have of Kuwait itself?
There
after its
were
liberation?
the memories of Kuwaiti people, and I compare and contrast them with the folks in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very conservative, Islamic. The way they approach. I mean, if you saw a lady in Saudi Arabia, all you saw was the burqa, head to toe. You didn't see anything of her. And when we went to Kuwait, very westernized. And so we would see these attractive young women. And the Arabic women are beautiful ladies and dressed in Calvin Kleins and look like college co-eds, and they were happy to see us. And that these poor people had, like I said, there had been a lot of atrocities. So when we got to Kuwait City, it was night and day. An Islamic country, but very westernized, very liberal in their approach to Islam. As best I understand it, I'm comparing that with Saudi Arabia. So yeah, when those people saw us, they were just overjoyed to see that we were there.
And did the part of Kuwait you saw, did it look like it had been beaten up by an occupying force?
Oh yeah, I've got a lot of pictures of Kuwait City that I took. I took a picture of a Chuck E. Cheese in Kuwait City that had just been shot to pieces. Is obviously a Chuck E. Cheese, and there was a KFC, and so there was all these. It looked very westernized with the commerce that they had, and the restaurants and fast food and all that. Yeah, everything that we saw had been shot up, and there was a lot of destruction in Kuwait City. Yeah.
Yeah. Another famous image that comes from the Gulf War is the oil fields on fire. Yeah. Did you see that as well?
Yeah, that was a real ghostly looking sight. Most of the way the prevailing winds were in that part of the country, we were west of where those oil field fires were, and so the big plumes of smoke that you would see in the pictures and on the television reporting at the time, that was kind of a backdrop to what that's what we saw. We saw those oil field fires, and occasionally we did drive around those old field fires, and it was just, it looked like Dante's hell. I mean, it was just awful looking. One day, the wind shifted, and from where we were at, we were just sitting there waiting for our time to go back home, and the wind shifted, and it blew back all that oil field smoke blew over us, and it, day became night. It was just almost pitch black. You had to drive around with your vehicle lights on. Wow. It was really something.
Wow.
And from that position, I think I counted, on the horizon how many oil wells that I saw on fire, and I somewhere around 90 or 100 it seemed that I could see just looking across it. That is a huge oil field, and all those wells. Wow. Saddam had his military light them up.
Yeah. So you're seeing kind of different things. You're seeing these soldiers, the Republican Guard maybe deserve some respect, although in the end, they were overpowered pretty easily. These other Iraqi forces, you mentioned this guy with the Chicago Bears sweatshirt, kind of maybe feel sorry for them. On the other side, you see what Iraqi forces did in Kuwait when they were the more powerful force. What was your own kind of disposition? I'll just kind of make it a real vague kind of question, then just let you respond. Your own disposition to Iraq at that time, because, from that moment, the United States, from that time, 1990, 1991, the United States has had, a relationship with Iraq that most Americans who are at least basically aware of the news know that this country's, and that relationship really begins here for most Americans. For me, for example, I'd never thought about Iraq at all until the Gulf War. And then, of course, it's going to be in the news pretty much constantly for the next 2 decades. What was your own thinking about that country, about that government, about that place, given these very different sides? On the one side, you see people who look pretty weak. On the other side, you see people who, when they're in the stronger position, pretty brutal. In Kuwait. What was your own disposition toward Iraq at that time?
We understood, and maybe just because being in the Guard, I had a little bit more interest in some of the things that went on over there. But after a while, the Middle East, there's always something going on. But the war in the 80s between Iran and Iraq, we were aware of that, or I was aware of that, and I knew the chemical munitions had been used, and that was an ongoing horrific war between those two countries. And I believe that U.S. provided a lot of military hardware to Iraq in the 80s. And as a matter of fact, we saw a lot of, I don't remember any weapons per se that we saw shot up over there, but there were a lot of old deuce and a halves and 5 tons that were American made that were had Iraqi markings on them that were just targets for us. So thinking about that, when I think about Iraqis, really all I saw of Iraqis, like I said, I never saw a shot fired at me or any member of my battery in anger, besides the silly Scuds. Most of the Iraqis that I encountered, like you said, the fellow that could speak English that was conscripted, they were just looking for a place to surrender. They were tired of that regime themselves. We never faced, thank the Lord, we never faced any of the Republican Guard. I'm sure those boys would have changed our opinions of the Iraqi military, because they were an elite, hard-nosed unit, those units of the Republican Guard. So when I think about the Iraqis themselves, I think that, they were people under a dictator, obviously, and they had to toe the mark for Saddam. And then, of course, the history after Desert Storm, hindsight's always 20/20. People thought that we should have gone on up there and finished the job and taken Saddam out, because as I understood, we figured that the Iraqi people would rise up after Desert Storm and take him out themselves. Well, obviously that never happened.
I wanted to ask you that because, as, history continues to move, then the next big political debate is, should we just keep going to Baghdad and remove this guy? And President Bush said, look, I didn't bring the coalition together to do that. I brought the coalition together to liberate Kuwait. So we're not going to do that. Did you have an opinion at the time about whether we should press on
No.
to Baghdad or not?
I didn't. You know, when you're down at battery level, then you're not, where all the big wheels are making those big decisions, and certainly
Yeah.
not politically. So, we are, at that point, you're just a soldier. And, hey, it's over, let's go home. We weren't thinking that far ahead. I've read later that there were units that, after the ceasefire, they were in a position where they could see where there were Iraqi units, and those Iraqi units were starting to abuse some of the people that were in their sectors, and some of those. And this is all just word of mouth. I never really knew this. I've not read this, or maybe I did read it somewhere, but that the American troops, the American forces were looking across whatever that dividing line was in the sand, and they saw the Iraqis over there, and they felt like, oh, man, let's go over there and take them out. They're asserting themselves again. We're never in that position. We never saw that happen. Again, we were happy to hear that it was over and that we were going to get to go back home.
Yeah. When the invasion of 2003, now there is going to be an invasion of Iraq in 2003, part of the war against terrorism. When that happened, or in the lead up to that, the big debate about whether or not this was a good idea, did you reflect back on your time in the Gulf and that debate about whether we should have gone into Baghdad?
Yeah.
And had you developed an opinion by that point about whether we should or shouldn't have gone into Baghdad in 1990?
I feel like
91?
we should have. Hindsight's always 20/20, and thinking, gosh, if we'd done this 13 years or 12 years previously, we wouldn't have to be doing it now. Yeah. So I thought about that, and but George H.W. Bush, he had the mandate from the UN, and he spelled it out. He said, we were not supposed to take Saddam out. We were just supposed to restore the sovereignty of Kuwait and protect Saudi Arabia and protect the oil fields. Probably wasn't said as in so many words, but that was a big reason why we were over there.
Yeah. And I'm interested in hearing your own thoughts about the invasion of 2003 and the aftermath, of course, at the very beginning. The very beginning looks a lot like what you're describing the Gulf War. The Iraqi forces are backing up, defeated pretty easily. The statue comes down, the big statue of Saddam comes down. Looks like everything's great. Looks like we got another pretty easy victory against this guy. And then the insurgency begins. And, things unravel from there. What was your own sort of disposition, having, you were in that part of the world, what the air feels like there, you saw a little bit of the culture, you had some interaction with Iraqis. What was your own sort of relationship with that whole period in American history, 2003 to, we get into the Obama presidency when the troops leave Iraq, but then, of course, U.S. troops go back, right, because of the Syria situation.
Yeah.
What is as a military officer, I guess, but also as someone who spent time on the ground in the Gulf, what was your own relationship with that unfolding news story?
Well, I've got a friend, and this helps me to understand the difference of when I was there and when he was there. He was there during Operation Iraqi Freedom. He saw some bad stuff. And the difference between when we were there and after 2003, number one, we did not face an insurgency. There were no roadside bombs. We would travel up and down those roads, no worries about roadside bombs or IEDs or anything like that.
Right.
Desert Storm was a conventional warfare. It really was. There's set piece movements. We were talking about corps and division, the 7th Corps, and then the 18th Airborne Corps, or 17th, I forget what it is, and the French and the British. Everybody was over there, and it was very set piece. What we did in Desert Storm. When I talk about the left hook, Schwarzkopf's left hook out of the western Iraqi desert, I mean, that's straight out of West Point. Those guys, they practice envelopments, fix them in the front. It was very conventional. When you fast forward 12 years to 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that warfare changed so much. That they had faced that insurgency. non-conventional, the roadside bombs, the IEDs, and things like that. We did not face that at all. So when I think about, and I'm not sure if I'm getting to your question per se, but there was a huge difference in what we faced in Desert Storm. I do not try to minimize. I forget, it's either 135 or 235 actual combat deaths in Desert Storm, somewhere that, and I don't, precious American lives.
Sure.
But compared to what we faced then in Operation Iraqi Freedom or in Afghanistan later, the different ways that U.S. troops, the different things that they faced, night and day, it really was,
Yeah, just the insurgency that breaks out. And I imagine the Vietnam vets who are still in, I've talked to Vietnam vets, they went into the military at the very end of the Vietnam War, and they ended their career in the military with Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Sort of these two insurgent, in insurgent wars. When you look back on that whole Gulf War period, the news comes, and all of a sudden we're going from Northwest Arkansas to the Middle East, and you don't know what's coming, and so you're wearing the outfits to protect you from the gear to protect you from possible chemical attacks and all of this, and then actually how the war, how the conflict unfolds, the oil fields, the highway of death, the other convoy you saw. What most sticks out in your mind about that whole period? What sort of, if your mind drifts back to that period, is there a particular thing that it sort of tends to go to more than any other thing?
Well, I was proud to be a member of an Army National Guard unit. Like I said, here I am years later, and you look back fondly. Your perspective changes somewhat.
Yeah.
The U.S. military is a tremendous force, and honestly, they didn't need us over there. We were part of an overwhelming amount of firepower. But even then, they didn't need my little National Guard Field Artillery Brigade per se. But we went over there and we did our mission. And I think Arkansas could be proud of the fact that we went over there and did what we did. And so here I am, a cheerleader for the Arkansas Army National Guard and all National Guards. I think about, in reference to your question, the Guard stood up. We were called upon to do our mission. We stood up and did our mission. The 142nd did. And then in succeeding years, as I look back at Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, the Arkansas Army National Guard has been called up various numbers of times. They went, Congressman Steve Womack was the battalion commander of a unit that went to the Sinai for a year, stood up and did their mission, Arkansas Army National Guard unit. So when I look back over the years and I see how the Guard and the reserves, how they're called upon to do their missions, I'm just proud to say that the National Guard was able to do their mission, whether in my Guard unit and other Guard units. Of course, not all of them are artillery units, obviously. Some of them might be the 148th EVAC Hospital in Little Rock was activated for Desert Storm as well, and they stood up and did a fine job over there. Yeah. So I guess I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, but when I think back about that, I'm proud to say that we were able to represent the Arkansas Army National Guard, as have other Arkansas Army National Guard units in more recent conflicts, Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and that's what I look back fondly and remember the most, that we were able to do our job. It was a unit that I was not, it was a unit within my brigade, Bravo Battery, 2nd Battalion, 142nd Field Artillery, here in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. And I was down there at that annual training event for the 2nd Battalion. I was there in another role. And the Bravo Battery, the 2nd Battalion, was making a night move. And as they were making their night move, of course, it was tactical. So there weren't headlights or anything like that. It was very low visibility, a lot of dust, Fort Chaffee at night. You know, it was well after the hours of darkness.
Yeah.
And the howitzer that Sergeants Tanner and Harrison were riding, they were the only two on top of the howitzer. The driver missed a low water bridge, and the howitzer turned over, and those two individuals were killed.
Wow.
And terrible thing to have happened, but it always exemplified to me the NCO Corps of the 142nd, how dedicated they were to doing what they had to do. And eventually the 142nd going to the Gulf, I think, was built on NCOs like those fellas.